Welcome, dear listener. Tonight's story is a slow descent into the hidden corners of an old London apartment building, where the walls carry whispers and the floors remember footsteps long gone. It is called The Rats Beneath. In 5 chapters, you'll follow the weary caretaker of Calvert House as he begins to notice faint scratching noises in the walls. At first, they seem harmless, an inconvenience blamed on rats. But as the days stretch on and as tenants vanish one by one, those sounds reveal something far more disturbing. This tale is grounded in the ordinary, the pipes, the corridors, the neighbours you might pass without a second glance. And yet, as the caretaker soon discovers, the ordinary has a way of concealing the unbearable. So settle back, let your body grow heavy, allow your breathing to slow, and as the world outside grows quiet, let us step together into the shadows of Calvert House and uncover what waits beneath. The first time I heard the scratching, it was faint enough that I thought it belonged to the boiler. I was sitting at the desk in my makeshift office, what used to be the laundry room off the lobby, going through the damp log, ticking boxes and circling the ones that would mean complaints from tenants later. At first, it was just a few irregular taps, like a loose pipe settling against brick. But then it came again, sharper, a dry skitter across plaster above my head. Not the sound of water or heating, but of something alive. I set my pen down and held my breath. The noise stuttered, then stopped. The ceiling seemed to listen back. I rubbed the heel of my hand over my eyes and told myself not to start hearing things just because I was alone in this building more often than not. The intercom buzzed, making me jump. A familiar voice crackled through, weak with age but firm with complaint. "They're at it again," Mrs. Callow said. "Above the wardrobe this time. Keeping me up." I pressed the button. "I'll come up." The keys at my hip clinked like a jailer's as I stood. I had every door on the ring, the weight of other people's privacy tugging at my pocket. This building was my job, though the landlord liked to remind me it wasn't much of one. "Caretaker," he'd said when he hired me, "not manager. You've got hands. Use them." That was 4 years ago, and I'd been using them ever since, fixing locks, clearing drains, repainting the same patches of wall that bubbled every winter. The building itself sat hunched on a narrow street that once led to the river before the city paved and built and forgot its waterways. It used to be a tailoring factory, a place where men in shirt sleeves sewed linings by hand. You could still see it in the bones, the tall windows, the lift with its wire gate, the long corridors where fabric once hung. The brick was tired, the timber beams notched too many times for too many purposes. If you listened, you could almost hear its past rattling in the dark corners. On the 3rd floor, the hallway light stuttered before buzzing to life. A cone of weak yellow spilled over the carpet runner. I heard the scratching again, this time along the corridor ahead of me, as though something travelled with purpose, just out of sight. I followed it to 3C. Mrs. Callow had already moved her bed away from the wall and cleared the space around her wardrobe. She was a thin woman, folded in on herself, her grey hair pinned back as though she still expected company even at night. She looked tired, the shadows beneath her eyes deeper than usual. "There," she said, pointing above the moulding. I stepped closer and pressed my knuckles to the plaster. It was cold, but under it ran a faint tremor, like a distant heartbeat. A moment later came the gnawing, slow and deliberate teeth dragging across wood. Then silence again, as though whatever made the sound knew we were listening. "Rats," I said. "I'll put bait boxes in the voids. You'll hear more before you hear less." Her mouth tightened. "How many?" "Hard to say." She crouched, pointed to the base of the wardrobe. A few black droppings lay scattered like punctuation marks, old and new. Along the skirting board ran a dark smear, greasy to the touch. I rubbed my fingers together and the smell clung, ammonia dust and the stale tang of fur. "They're in the walls," she whispered. "They come when he listens." "Who?" Her eyes flicked toward the door. "The man downstairs, the one with the violin records. He sits with the radio tuned wrong between stations. It makes a whine. The noises are worse then." I didn't answer that. I told her the usual. Keep food sealed, no crumbs. Her flat was tidy as a chapel anyway. On my way out, I paused by her vent. A faint draught pulled inward, the ductwork sucking the stale air down into the bowels of the building. The system was a maze no one had mapped in decades, perfect for something small, something that thrived on dark. By week's end, the intercom buzzed near every day. A student in 2D said she'd heard something thump inside her wardrobe, like a hand hitting from the other side. The baker on the first floor swore he'd seen one run across his counter, though he was known to drink in the afternoons and invent pests that weren't there. Then, just before dawn one morning, I got a voicemail from 4A, a whisper, like he was trying not to wake someone beside him. "They're inside the loft," he said. "They're heavier now." Heavier. I laid traps. I pushed bait behind pipes, set down dust to track prints. The basement traps I'd set weeks ago were untouched, not even nibbled. Whatever was moving inside these walls was too clever to fall for cheap wood and spring steel. The dust told me more. In the morning, I found tiny footprints crossing the hallways in patterns, trails sliding under doors, mapping routes with precision. Under 1B's door, the line was darkest. The tenant of 1B hadn't paid rent in 2 months. A quiet man, cash only, barely spoke. I knocked. No answer. I unlocked the door. The smell met me immediately. Not garbage, but stale air, damp clothes, and something faintly sweet, like fruit rotting in a closed jar. His bed was made, but the sheet was smooth with age, not with use. The wardrobe stood empty, a single wire hanger swaying. On the kitchen floor, the plinth had been chewed away into a dark U-shape. Prints overlapped in the dust like frantic handwriting. Above the skirting, a fist-sized hole gaped into the wall. I crouched, torch in hand, and looked inside. A crawl of timber, wires bundled with tape, insulation sagging. The smell was sour, green, like vegetables left in water too long. I stepped back, the emptiness of the flat pressing on me. I wrote his name on my clipboard and placed a question mark beside it. That afternoon, I borrowed a ladder and opened the hatch into the ceiling void above the second-floor corridor. The space was warm, low, insulation scratching at my arms. My torch caught a nest in the corner, shredded bags, cloth strips, a pencil stub, a button, even a milk bottle ring. In the middle lay bones, tiny bird bones, fragile and neat. The nest had design to it, paths leading outward, order where there should have been chaos. Then came a sound like a sigh through wet cloth. Breath. My beam slid across pale skin, stretched taut, dimpled and swollen like dough left too long. The surface shifted, and something beneath it flexed. I backed out of the void before I thought about it. Some things you don't move closer to. That night, I stayed in the office. Past midnight, the hallway lights blinked one after the other, a ripple like footsteps. Then the intercom buzzed. "It's like they're pushing at the walls," said the student in 2D. Her voice shook. "They're heavy, like furniture moving." I told her I'd look in the morning, but the words felt useless. The next day, a note was slipped under my door. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. "I have to complain again. The scratching is making me ill. They're in the cupboards now. Also, the man in 1B is missing. The last time I saw him, he was putting something heavy into a black bag. He smiled at me like we shared a joke. Please do something." It was signed by the violin man. He let me in at once, as though he'd been waiting by the door. He was tall, angular, his hair parted with care. The flat smelled of varnish and boiled potatoes. He led me to the kitchen, where a radio hissed between stations. A thin whine threaded the air, more vibration than sound. "Listen," he said, and beneath the hiss, the scratching came again, slow, deliberate, moving from wall to floor to ceiling. Dust rained from the light fixture. "They're worse at night," he whispered. I drilled an inspection hole behind his cooker. The plaster gave way with a sigh, dust spilling dark with age. Behind it ran ducting, dented and sagging, but one bend bulged oddly, the foil stretched thin like a blister. My torch caught movement inside. The blister gave with a pop, and the smell poured out, wet, sweet, rancid. The first rat slid free, bloated so grotesquely its limbs were half swallowed by its body. Its fur clung wet, its eyes small but alert. It dragged itself across the skirting with effort, leaving a smear. Another followed, just as swollen, and another behind that. They moved with purpose, not frenzy, as though they were used to their burden. The violin man staggered back pale. I told him it was just rats, though the lie tasted bitter. I set heavy traps and taped a bag over the hole. In the morning, one trap held a knot of tails writhing together. The other was gone, the wire snapped clean. Not gnawed, cut. I left more traps, promised pest control, though I knew the landlord would balk at the expense. My phone calls that day went unanswered, the line buzzing wrong, busy when it shouldn't be. By evening I was in the basement again, following the sour smell. Past the meter room, down a forgotten corridor, I forced open a rotted door. The crawl space beneath the foundations spread out like the building's grave. My torch beam found them. Plastic bags piled like a quilt, bulging, their seams stretched near bursting. The rats had dragged them here. Some bags had split, pale shapes pushing through. I crouched, my breath shallow. Inside one bag, under fluid, gleamed bones. A radius. The curve of a pelvis. A scattering of smaller bones like gravel. Not old, fresh. I swung the beam and saw more. Each bag held parts, some with tags still tied, paper soaked but legible. I read the letters slowly, unwilling. Callow. Another bag with a faint D. Another with a red ribbon. The rats moved among them, swollen but deliberate, their bellies sloshing faintly as they fed. They had abundance here. They weren't sick. They were full. In the far corner, bones had been arranged. A skull propped on a brick, jaw wedged open. Long bones leaned around it in a cone, as though set for a fire. The arrangement was too deliberate to be accident. A sound came behind me, footsteps or the echo of them. I swung the torch and found him there, the violin man standing in the threshold. He held one of the traps, jaws open, metal gleaming. "I followed you," he said softly. "I couldn't bear not to know." I gestured to the bags. He looked, nodded as though seeing confirmation of something he already believed. "So they're not ill," he murmured. "They're full." "We need to leave," I said. "Call the police." He touched the skull, reverent. "Bones are nothing without their stories." Something rolled against my boot. I looked down, a finger bone, pale and light, tapping against the rubber like it wanted my attention. My foot sank into a torn bag, liquid seeping cold. Teeth clattered out like beads. I turned the torch to the far wall. Flattened boxes leaned there, scrawled with old tenant handwriting. Kitchen, books, shoes. On the last, one word in thick black marker, bones. And beneath it, smaller, precise, a second word, mine. At its base lay a neat circle of human teeth, and in the centre a key stamped 1B. I didn't leave Calvert House that night. I told myself I stayed because the police would want me close, but the truth was plainer. I couldn't face the idea of stepping out past the front door, leaving all that I had seen sealed up in the dark. If I left, it would be waiting when I came back, heavier for being ignored. Better to sit in the light of the office fan and pretend I was caretaker enough for whatever had nested under our foundations. The violin man lingered too, as though some current bound us both to the building now. He had settled himself in the lobby's armchair, long fingers folded, his face as calm as the plaster saints you see in old churches. He carried his composure like armour, and that calmness unsettled me more than any rat's scratching. I tried the desk phone again, repeating what I'd already told the emergency operator, forcing the words into sentences that sounded practical. Remains discovered. Evidence of missing tenants, human bones. But even saying them aloud seemed to change the air in the office. The walls pressed closer. "They'll come soon," the violin man said softly from the doorway, though I hadn't asked him. "You sound certain," I said. He inclined his head, a tiny smile crossing his lips. "Buildings like this don't stay secret. They sweat their history out. Always." I wanted to argue, but before I could, the intercom buzzed. It was the student from 2D, voice thin and raw. "Can you come up, please? It's worse tonight. I can feel them in the tiles. They bow when I step." "I'll be there," I said, though my mouth was dry. I took the long way, up 2 flights, torch in hand, though the hall lights worked fine. The second floor smelled faintly metallic, as though something sharp had been cut recently. The student's door was already open a crack. She stood in her hoodie, sleeves pulled to her knuckles, hair tied back like she'd been yanking at it for hours. "In there," she whispered. The bathroom was bright with the harsh ceiling bulb. The white tiles looked ordinary until you noticed how the grouting cracked in little zigzags, fine lines running like veins. At the fan grill above the shower, plaster had powdered down the wall. The slats bowed faintly inward, and when I flicked the switch, the fan coughed, spun reluctantly, then steadied. The grill flexed in and out, as though it were breathing. And then it knocked. A soft, deliberate tap, like someone inside the duct had tapped back. The girl caught her breath, hugging herself. "Do you see?" I pressed my palm against the wall beside the vent. The vibration was unmistakable. Something alive shifting in the space, heavy enough to disturb the plaster, steady enough to make me doubt this was chance. "Keep this door closed," I told her. "And the fan off. Understand?" She nodded, though it was the kind of nod that says I'll do anything if it makes you leave faster. Back in the corridor, the violin man was waiting. He moved quietly for such a tall figure, as though he knew how to shape himself to the silence. "They're learning the lines," he said, voice too calm. "What lines?" I snapped, harsher than I meant. "The ones between rooms, between walls. Rats map spaces better than we do." I stared at him, the way his eyes lingered on the skirting boards, as if he could hear something I couldn't. His words made the whole corridor feel thinner, stretched like paper ready to tear. By the time I returned to the lobby, the police had arrived. A uniformed pair first, then a sergeant whose eyes were sharp as glass. Their torches were stronger than mine, the beams slicing through Calvert House like surgical instruments. "Show us," the sergeant said, and I led them down. In the crawl space, their lights caught everything I'd seen. The sagging plastic bags, the pale bones pushing against seams, the circle of teeth around the key stamped 1B. One officer photographed in silence while another marked where my boots had disturbed the dust. The sergeant crouched near the pile of boxes, reading the black scrawl, "Kitchen, shoes, bones," with the same detached face I'd seen coroners wear in photographs. "You touched nothing?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. He turned to one of his men. "Secure this. Call scenes." Then to me, "Names. I want a list of every tenant here. Anyone missing. Anyone you can't account for." I nodded. My mind went straight to 3C, Mrs. Callow, and to 1B, the silent flat that smelled like absence. When we came back up, the violin man was still in the lobby, sitting as though waiting his turn. He looked at me as I passed, his expression unreadable, and said, "They'll want to open every cupboard, every wall. Do you think the building will like that?" I didn't answer. Instead, I climbed to 3C. The hallway light buzzed faintly overhead. I unlocked her door. Her flat was neat, as it always had been, kettle-polished, the bed folded tight, the line of glass birds catching what little evening sun filtered through. The wardrobe was still dragged from the wall, the smear on the skirting darker now. Her reading glasses sat on the table, beside a newspaper folded open to the crossword. A few answers had been scrawled in, the ink thick where she'd corrected herself. I called her name once, softly. No reply. The silence was heavier than any answer. I searched. Bathroom, cupboard, under the bed. Nothing. It was like she had stepped out mid-task, mid-word, and never stepped back in. On my way out, I thought I heard scratching above the vent near her window. When I leaned close, the sound stopped instantly, as though listening back. By afternoon, more police had arrived. Scenes of crime cordoned off the basement, their tents and crates littering the lobby. The sergeant barked orders about rosters, interviews, cordons. He wanted tenants in their rooms, doors shut. My job was to help, to keep the building contained like a patient strapped to a bed. Most tenants obeyed. They peeked out, whispered questions, then withdrew. Only the violin man disobeyed. He propped open his door with a wedge and kept his radio tuned to that thin knife edge between stations, the frequency that made the air itself feel like pressure on your skin. When I stepped inside, he gestured to the marks he'd been making on a takeaway menu, X's drawn where the scratching came most often. "See? Closer now. They've learned." "Learned what?" I asked. "That pressure makes paths," he said. "Turn a room the right way and things move through easier. The rats know it. We don't." I didn't want his words in my head. I left. By evening, the building changed. The power flickered and died on the stairwell. A weak emergency strip glowed green, and then, as though on cue, knocks began along the second-floor corridor. 3 slow raps in sequence, as if someone inside the walls were walking parallel to me, knocking as they went. Tenants opened doors nervously. Faces peered out. I told them to shut their doors, to stay inside. But in 2B, a young mother clutched her child, her eyes fixed on the wall behind her sofa. "It comes here," she whispered. "He laughs." She meant the boy. Children laugh at noises before they learn what those noises mean. I kept moving. The air in the corridor seemed thick, humming faintly with the violin man's radio. The sound was everywhere at once, vibrating the plaster, the glass, even my teeth. When I entered his flat again, he was by the hole I'd cut behind the cooker. The bag I'd taped over it had been pushed loose from the inside. The duct sagged like tired skin. "Turn it off," I said, nodding to the radio. He didn't. He turned the dial a fraction, and the tone climbed until it was almost beyond hearing. The air thickened, heavy enough that the hair on my wrist rose, and then the duct gave way. The foil peeled with a wet sound. The first rat shouldered through, bloated, its belly dragging. Another pressed behind it, eyes dark and small but certain. They moved slowly, deliberately, not like animals fleeing, but like creatures following a path they already knew. One climbed onto the counter, nose twitching at the trap I'd left baited. With calm precision, it nudged the peanut butter, then pressed the trigger so the jaws snapped where it wanted them to snap. The metal caught mid-body, and still it kept moving, its belly shifting as though something inside had turned over in its sleep. The violin man's voice was soft, reverent. "They don't turn when we ask. They turn when the air tells them." I couldn't stay. I shoved past him and ran for the stairs. On the first landing, the sergeant was coming up, face tight. "One of the bags split," he said. "We've got bones out. It's going to get messy." I wanted to ask whose bones. Instead, I followed him down. The crawl space was brighter now under their lights. The bags shimmered, rats moving among them with obscene slowness, bellies sloshing. The circle of teeth I'd seen had shifted, some scattered. The key stamped 1B nudged an inch from its place, and someone was down there with them. A man kneeling by one of the bags, untying a red ribbon with neat fingers. He looked up briefly, smiled like we'd shared a joke, then returned to his task. The sergeant shouted. The man ignored him. He reached into the bag and drew out a femur, handling it with the care of a musician lifting his instrument. He placed it against the others in the cone, adjusting the angle with satisfaction. The arrangement wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate. Ritual. The rats recoiled slightly, just enough to prove even they recognized the change. The uniforms moved in, cautious, boots avoiding the slick patches. The man offered his wrists calmly when the cuffs came, but before they dragged him up, he tweaked the alignment of a smaller bone, as though finishing a puzzle. His face emptied, then filled with relief. As they led him past me, he said softly, "People don't like gaps. They fill them, rats too." Later, when the lobby filled with uniforms and crates, when neighbours craned from the street, when questions clattered like shutters in a storm, I went back down once more. Alone at the threshold, I shone my weakening torch. The arrangement remained neat, too neat. At the base lay 3 small metacarpals in a row, as if someone had paused mid-count. Beside them, on a plastic flap sticky with seepage, tags were fanned like cards. The top one bore a name. The ink had bled but remained legible. Not Callow, not anyone from 1B. It was the surname of the student from 2D, underlined twice. The string bright, unsoaked, new. I stood very still. The building around me hummed faintly with the sound of rats moving along their maps, heavy with abundance. I didn't sleep that night. The office chair creaked under me as I sat staring at the rain-speckled window, watching Calvert House pretend it was part of the city around it. Outside, London woke like it always did. Delivery vans shouldering into parking spaces, cyclists cutting across puddles, the impatient cough of engines waiting for lights. Inside, the air refused to reset. It had grown sour like a breath held too long. The desk fan ticked in the corner, each rotation sounding like a joint ready to give way. My stomach felt hollow, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. Whenever I thought of food, I thought of the crawl space and those swollen rats pushing against the plastic bags, their bellies shifting with the obscene certainty of things being digested. I told myself I'd stayed to keep the building secure until the police were satisfied. The truth was simpler. If I stepped outside, I might not have the courage to return. Better to stay inside the sickness than face it fresh again. At 7:30, the sergeant returned. He had the look of a man who had shaved in cold water, shirt collar sharp enough to suggest he never slept. He rapped his knuckles lightly on the doorframe before stepping in, as though he were testing the wood. "We'll move slow today," he said. "Pathologists arrive at 9. I'll need temporary access to your master keys." I slid the ring across the desk. The weight left my palm like a tooth pulled, something missing that would ache in phantom form. As he turned, I said, "There's one thing I didn't hand over last night." The words came with heat, as if admitting a theft. I opened the drawer and took out the paper tag I'd pocketed. The string was bright, the ink clean, the name written carefully and underlined twice, the surname of the girl in 2D. I found it near the crawl space, on top. Fresh. I didn't want to panic anyone. The sergeant lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger, his face unreadable. "We'll speak to her now." I followed them upstairs. The girl opened her door on the first knock. She hadn't slept. Her hair was tied and untied so many times it stuck in restless tufts, eyes raw from rubbing. A bowl of cereal sat on the counter, milk filmed over, spoon balanced like an unfinished sentence. "You're safe," the sergeant said gently. "May we come in?" She nodded. He asked for her full name, her address, the names of anyone who had visited recently. He wrote each detail carefully, as though handwriting could steady reality. When he finished, he told her, "We'll keep an officer outside your door. Lock it. If you hear anything unusual, don't investigate. Call us." "What counts as unusual?" she asked. "Anything you didn't hear last week?" She nodded again, but her lips moved like she was testing the words against her teeth. After he left, she touched my sleeve. "This is about the basement, isn't it?" she whispered. "What you found?" I had nothing honest to give her. "I'll tell you when I can," I said. It sounded like I'd borrowed the words from someone else. In the corridor, the violin man had his door open the width of the chain. He had dressed already, collar buttoned, hair neat, but his eyes fixed on the skirting as if it whispered to him. "They'll frighten her," he said. "She should be frightened," I told him. Fear might keep her still. His lips curved faintly, neither smile nor sneer, and the radio in his flat hummed its thin static, the sound of a blade pressed against glass. The pathologists arrived just before 9. A tidy woman with iron-grey hair and a younger man who followed carefully in her wake. They descended into the crawlspace with the sergeant and returned an hour later smelling faintly of antiseptic soap layered over something sweet and spoiled. The woman asked for site plans. I fetched the brittle roll of paper from the cupboard under the stairs, a relic of when Calvert House had been a factory. The plan showed ducts designed for steam and dust, never for bones. She photographed it and thanked me, a small, steady word that lodged in my chest. Gratitude in this place felt like proof we were still people. By mid-morning, the building behaved like a patient under observation. Doors stayed closed. Voices clipped themselves into short phrases. Tenants who had work called in sick without using the word. The baker brought a tray of croissants for the officers, but was turned away. Even kindness felt suspicious here. Around 11, the smell changed. What had been sickly sweet edged into iron. I tasted it on my teeth before I recognized it. The constable posted by 2D wrinkled his nose. "You smell that?" he asked. "They're moving," I said. I didn't explain who they were. A moment later, the bathroom fan in 2D chattered and stopped on its own. The girl inside didn't open the door. At noon, the landlord's office called. A clipped voice told me not to speak to the press. There is no value in speculation. Direct inquiries to us. I told him I was busy keeping the building intact. He said he was busy keeping its reputation intact. We thanked each other through gritted teeth. When I hung up, the violin man stood silently in my doorway, as if he'd been waiting. His shirt was buttoned wrong, one out of sequence. For the first time, he looked frayed. "They won't find the right shape," he murmured. "What shape?" I asked. "The bones. They'll think it's theatre. It isn't. It's a map, a pressure path." He saw my expression and gave a soft, self-mocking laugh. "I sound mad. Maybe I am. I've listened to this building too long." "You could turn the radio off," I said. He didn't. The static rose faintly, filling the room with pressure that seemed to shift the plaster. By early afternoon, I was prying open a cupboard behind 2C, following his hint. The panel screws came loose with a sound like wet paint tearing. Behind the wood lay a riser shaft, brick-lined, wide enough for a man. Dust recorded movement, rat paws, tail drags, and heavier scrapes. A ring glinted where cable met brick, a thin band with a cloudy stone. I pocketed it, promising myself I'd label it later. Then something shifted above, dust sifting into my hair, the sound of weight reconsidering itself. I ducked back as a small collapse tumbled down the shaft, coughing stale air into the corridor. "You all right?" the constable asked. "Fine," I lied. We strung tape across the cupboard with a marker scrawled "Do not enter." It looked like a child's attempt at authority. At 2, the pathologist emerged from the crawl space. Some tags are genuine, some false. The arrangement isn't random, it's purposeful. The sergeant frowned. "Purposeful how?" "Theatrical is for others to see," she said. "This is for the person doing it." That evening, we removed the bathroom grill in 2D. The screws came out neatly as though already loosened. Inside the duct, the torch found not a body but a plaster mask, saint-like, soot-darkened, its expression benign until you noticed it watching from within the wall. The student sat on her bed, blanket folded in her lap like a book she couldn't open. "Is someone in there?" she whispered. "No," I said, but the word felt temporary. By dusk, the smell thickened again. The constable outside 2D knocked gently. "You all right in there?" "Yes," she answered after a pause. When we unlocked the door later, the flat smelled wrong, not of food or people, but of the void. The fan hung loose by its wire, screws lined neatly on the sink. Her bedroom was empty, the blanket still folded, the impression of her body left in the mattress. The wardrobe door gaped. Behind it, the panel flexed like skin. I pried it loose, torch in hand. The cavity beyond widened into the riser, filled with scraps. A red ribbon, bent glasses I recognized as Mrs. Callow's, plastic bag shreds, bone fragments gnawed into order. A line of phalanges lay like chalks in a row. At the floor's edge, something had rolled free, a tooth, worn down by years of grinding. Beside it lay a key on bright new string. The tag's ink still glistened under the torch. The student's surname, underlined twice. The sergeant stood very still. "Clear the floor," he ordered softly. "This is a scene." When we stepped into the hall, the violin man was waiting in his doorway, hands clasped. "I didn't have to tune the radio," he said quietly. "The building's doing it itself now." He was right. The walls hummed faintly like a throat preparing to speak. I had started leaving the lights on in the office overnight, though I told myself it was for the police who came and went. The truth was simpler. I couldn't bear to see Calvert House dark anymore. In daylight, the building looked tired but solid, brick shoulders hunched against rain, windows puffing steam like sighs. At night, though, the shadows rearranged themselves, and the plaster seemed to swell and settle with things I couldn't name. The sergeant had stationed 2 constables on rotation in the hall outside 2D. They walked with the stiffness of men trying not to breathe too deeply. The girl's door remained sealed, though it didn't matter. She wasn't in there anymore. Her absence was louder than any noise. I spent the morning with a mop in hand, though the corridors were already clean. I moved water back and forth, listening to the building rather than working. The scratch came in pulses now, less like animals moving and more like something testing its own strength. At 9:30, the violin man found me outside the lift. He carried nothing, but his shirt smelled faintly of dust and his shoes had brick powder on them. "They've shifted the weight," he said. "Who has?" I asked. He tilted his head toward the wall, as though the building itself were listening. "You'll know when it breaks." I hated how calm he sounded. My mop handle trembled in my grip, and I told myself it was from the draft funneling down the stairwell. Around midday, the power dipped. The bulbs glowed thinly for a breath before swelling bright again. It left an after-image on my eyes like a camera flash. The constable muttered about old wiring, but I knew Calvert House's wiring better than anyone. The surge hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside, from the walls themselves. I checked the basement fuse box anyway, torch in hand. Down there, the smell struck me hard. Coppery, sharp, almost metallic enough to taste. Rats scurried along the brick, not frightened of me, not hurried, just moving with purpose, as though summoned. Their bellies bulged grotesquely, skin stretched thin. One paused to look at me, its black eyes reflecting my torch beam like mirrors. It didn't flee. It simply turned and followed the others, vanishing into a vent. The crawl space had been sealed with temporary police tape, but the tape sagged now, its adhesive softened by damp. I crouched, close enough to smell the cold breath rising from beneath. The building exhaled. I didn't stay long. By evening I was back upstairs, sitting in the office with the door ajar. The violin man's radio bled faint static into the corridor, thin as thread but insistent. Sometimes it fell silent, then returned with a single pure note that held too long, vibrating through the floorboards. At 6, he came to me again. He didn't knock, just leaned in the doorway, face pale in the strip light. "They're not scattered," he said. "They're arranged. You've seen it, haven't you?" I nodded. The rows of bones, the neat screws on the sink, the folded blanket. "They're drawing something," he said. "Not pictures. Pressure paths. The house remembers where it's weak. They're using the rats to map it." "Who's they?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Whoever's left." Then he returned to his flat and shut the door. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay on the office sofa listening to the pipes tick and groan. Around 2, a new sound rose beneath it, a soft, deliberate dragging, like a sack pulled across cement. My skin prickled. I pressed my ear to the floor, though I already knew what I'd hear. The sound wasn't beneath. It was within, between the joists, moving along the veins of the building. I stayed like that for an hour, unable to move, until the dragging faded. Morning brought no relief. The tenants kept their doors shut. The constables changed shift, muttering about overtime pay. And still the building waited, full of breath it couldn't release. I took my keys and checked the empty flats one by one. Most smelled only of dust and old plaster, but in 3B I found a new trace. A corner of wallpaper peeled back, exposing brick where something had pressed repeatedly from the other side. The pressure had left smudges dark as bruises. I touched the wall. It felt faintly warm. Back in the corridor, the violin man was waiting again. He looked at my hand as though he knew where I'd been. "It's moving faster now," he said. "Soon the pressure won't have anywhere left to go." "What happens then?" I asked. He didn't answer. His radio gave a sudden burst of static, sharp as a cry, and he turned back into his flat. That evening I sat at the desk and laid out the things I'd pocketed, the ring, the plaster mask, the tags. They looked pathetic spread across the wood, souvenirs from a sickness I couldn't name. I should have handed them all over. But part of me wanted proof for myself, something I could hold in case I ever doubted what I'd seen. Outside, the rain came hard, drumming the windows. The lights flickered again, longer this time. I felt the floor shudder just once, as if something vast had shifted its weight below. In the silence that followed, a rat squealed somewhere in the ducts, short and sharp, like a warning cut off mid-breath. I left the objects on the desk and sat back, waiting for whatever came next. I told myself the desk lamp was enough. One small circle of light to hold back the dark, as if Calvert House would respect boundaries. But the shadows pulled anyway, thick at the corners, heavy under the desk, gathering themselves like breath before speech. The rain had stopped. In its absence, the silence pressed too hard. Even the constables outside 2D were quiet. The building seemed to wait with them. Around midnight, the violin man's radio began again. Not the thin static this time, but a low, steady tone. It vibrated through the plaster, into the floorboards, into me. I stood and opened the office door. The corridor was empty, yet the sound grew stronger, guiding me toward the stairwell like a rope pulled tight. I descended. The basement door hung slightly open, police tape dangling uselessly from its frame. I didn't remember unlocking it. My torch beam caught the edges of damp brick, shining back in dull glints. The smell hit me halfway down the steps. Not just iron, not just rot. It was fuller, deeper, like earth turned inside out. The crawlspace tape had been ripped. I crouched and shone the torch inside. They were waiting. Rats, dozens of them, their bodies swollen beyond nature. Their bellies shifted visibly, something inside moving, pressing. None ran from the light. They simply parted, forming a path into the dark. I should have gone back up. Instead, I ducked inside. The ceiling forced me low. Pipes groaned above, dripping steadily onto the damp earth. The rats moved alongside me, their claws whispering over stone. My torch caught plastic sheeting ahead, crinkled and stained. I reached it, bags stacked like offerings, their knots stretched thin. Some had burst, bones spilled across the dirt, femurs, ribs, skulls gnawed clean. A few still bore scraps of clothing. Each pile carried a paper tag tied with new string. I bent closer. Mrs. Callow, 1B tenant, student 2D, each name written carefully, underlined twice. The rats nosed at the piles, not feeding now but waiting, as though the arrangement meant something to them too. Behind me, the radio tone deepened. I turned. The violin man stood at the crawlspace entrance, torch dangling loosely in his hand. His shadow stretched across the bags, warped over the skulls. "You see it now," he said. My throat was dry. "See what?" "The pattern. The pressure. The house has been showing us." He lifted his radio. The tone wavered, then steadied, resonating with the pipes above. The rats stirred, bodies shifting in unison. "It isn't random," he said softly. "Every bone placed where the house was weak, every name a marker. The tenants weren't just victims, they were instructions." The bags rustled, as though the house itself exhaled through them. "You helped it," I whispered. He smiled faintly. I only listened. The earth beneath my boots shifted. A crack ran through the dirt floor, thin at first, then widening with a sound like tearing cloth. The rats fled into it, bodies vanishing one after another as though drawn by gravity. The bags tipped, spilling bones into the gap. They clattered together, forming a loose lattice as if meant to reinforce the break. The violin man lowered his radio, and the tone stopped. For a moment, silence pressed hard. Then, from the crack, came movement, slow, deliberate, heavier than rats. I backed toward the crawlspace mouth. Something rose from beneath. Not a body, not whole, just bones, threaded with wire, bound with string, pulled upright by unseen hands. Skulls stacked where heads should be, ribs fanned like wings, femurs lashed into crude spines. The shape loomed, taller than the space should allow, a composite of the missing. Teeth clicked where speech might have been. The violin man bowed his head. "The house remembers," he said. I turned and crawled fast, scraping my hands on stone. Behind me the thing moved, dragging itself through the crack, bones rattling in rhythm. I burst into the basement corridor. The constables weren't there. The air above seemed colder, thinner. I staggered to the stairs, up into the ground floor. Doors along the corridor were open now. Tenants stood in their thresholds, silent, watching me. Their faces were pale, their eyes flat with something like acceptance. "Don't you hear it?" one whispered. And then I did. The building itself hummed, low and steady, vibrating through plaster and brick. The pipes shook gently, dust sifting from the ceiling. I ran for the office. On the desk, the objects I'd collected trembled. The ring, the mask, the tags. The key rolled, string dragging it toward the floor. Below, the sound of bones climbing echoed through the stairwell. I don't remember how long I sat there, back against the door, waiting for it to break. What I do remember is the scratching. Not scattered now, not frantic, coordinated, purposeful. Hundreds of claws moving as one, tracing lines in the walls, mapping the pressure the house wanted released. I thought of the tags, the names underlined twice. Not memorials, not theatre, instructions. The building wasn't haunted. It was remembering itself through us. And the rats, bloated, patient, obedient, were only its messengers. When the door finally shuddered behind me, I closed my eyes. And so, dear listener, our story of Calvert House comes to an end. The scratching in the walls has quieted, the footsteps have faded, and the caretaker's tale is now part of the silence. The house still stands, its bricks holding more than rain, its corridors remembering what was hidden beneath. But for tonight, you can let the echoes rest. Take a slow, deep breath in and release it gently. Allow your body to feel heavy and safe, knowing the story has been told. The sounds are gone now, and all that remains is stillness. May your dreams carry you someplace softer, far from the weight of old walls, and may your rest be peaceful. Good night.